The sight of Ponyville had never made Rarity so miserable. As the train swept through its final curve towards the little town, the dark spire of Hall rose to prick the overcast sky, as if to draw on even more of the icy specks of sleet that were muddling the view. The landmark was indisposable, confirmation that she was finally home. All of her disappointment and shame, which she had managed to push away during her journey, returned in a rush. Her heartbeat quickened painfully, and stiff, anxious pressure arose in her throat. She looked away from the window as Ponyville drew closer, sniffling once before blinking away at those hot tears threatening her makeup. Her parents would be waiting for her at the station, and she felt like she already had plenty to answer for. No need to complicate things even further than a show of emotion. That would only send her mother on a binge over hoovering, comforting, and generally smothering her for days. Rarity quickly checked herself over as the train slowly began to a fitful halt. She had her saddlebags, a gauzy scarf, and a light hat which seemed to be more practical in the almost unseasonably warm Manhattan weather. I should have known better, she reprehended herself. The village's lead was Weather Pony, an old mare named Hoarfrost, always brought winter to Ponyville early, calling in an extra cloud over to cause the temperature to plummet before Cloudsdale even started making its annual rounds. Rarity couldn't stand how the local population had tolerated it for so many years. As a village, she could remember thinking that the entire town seemed to either love the dead cold just as much as Hoarfrost or just didn't want to make any issue of it. That's Ponyville for you. A town full of ponies, either too meek to shake up the status quo or too stupid to even realize it needs shaking up. By contrast, the heat of the hubbub of Manhattan had been like a dream come true. But like all dreams, it had turned out to be a very short-lived one, and now she was being forced to wake up again. She glanced ruefully at the copy of Manhattan Times she had bought at the Grand Central Station to occupy her for the trip home. Manhattan's pride blew critics away at 996 pony promenade, once again rising the bar in the modern culture. The clocks counting down, and every pony started to push through the envelope of anticipation of the millennial summer celebration. Prim Hemline, one of the show's sponsors, told our reporters, although it's still 4 years away, it'll be a once-in-a-lifetime event, and every designer from here and to Baltimore knows that it's time to make their mark. There won't be any photos of the dresses worn at the events in the magazines. There will be in history books. Grayscale photographs sprawled across over most of the front page, showing proud mares and stallions strutting with practiced poise along with the fashion runaway, showcasing a dazzling array of sweeping gowns and severely trimmed suits. Even poor photography didn't detract much from the perfectly cut lines, the expertly creased palettes that seemed to magnify power and wit exactly what discriminating buyers from the Canterlot, Philadelphia, and Manhattan wanted. "Making a mark," Rarity whispered, as she dropped the paper back on the bench. "I have settled for working on the production line." As the train suddenly shuddered to a halt, she stood and made her way to the door. "Miss, excuse me, miss," a voice called out from behind her. "Did you forget this?" "Oh, I'm finished with it. You can just," she said, expecting that they were referring to the abandoned paper. She glanced back and saw the conductor, whose gray cheeks were buried underneath the monstrous mutton chops, holding up a sleek black portfolio. "Oh yes, I'm so sorry. Thank you." She accepted the portfolio with her magic and stepped out onto the cold, damp platform. For a moment she just stood there, fighting to keep her teeth from chattering as she looked around. Down the road she could see a tree that housed the town's library, and several of the first small shops and homes that have lined the northwestern edge of town. The streets were noticeably emptier than usual. However, she supposed that the sleet had driven every pony indoors in their warm quilts and hearths. It was way too early for the lamps that lined the streets to be lit. In the empty, soggy lanes that were left dim and lifeless, as they would between the walls of whose colors had been drained to muted tones of dead browns and lifeless grays. "Welcome home, Rarity," she groused in a mocking imitation of her mother's voice, feeling the heat of tears rising again. "So good to see you so soon. So how was your trip?" "Oh, just wonderful, Mother. Thank you for coming to pick me up." She was interrupted by several purple and blue trunks being hefted down for the train and deposited unceremoniously onto the platform in a series of wet trunks. She didn't think she was imagining the way the damp boards suddenly seemed to sag underneath them. "Where are these going, miss?" the conductor asked, breathing heavily as he stacked the sixth one into a pile. "Oh, my parents should be coming with a coach soon," she replied, glancing around the deserted streets again, and biting her lower lip. Could you please put them under the roof for now?" "Right away, miss," he said, gesturing to the other two ponies with him. After the luggage was out of the way, he blew a sharp note on the brass whistle and closed the door of the coach behind him. As the engine responded with a deep echoing blast of its own, and Rarity watched as it slowly began to heave itself away. She turned and regarded the empty streets again. For a little while, the only thing she was aware was the cold air in her nostrils and a tiny plip of sleet periodically hitting her hat. She scratched the foreleg with the other, and then gave a sort of sigh in resignation. Now what? She stood, until she realized her mane was starting to sag up in the damp. She shook herself and walked sluggishly to the protection of the overhanging roof, dropping her portfolio on the ground and turning away from it. The clock above the station showed 4:37. She had only spent 7 minutes at the station, but it already felt like 30. She sat down on the ground beside her trunk and, with nothing else to do, stared into the soupy gray expanse as she waited. At 4:51, her parents finally trolled up to the station and hired a carriage. The sleet transitioned to a bitter semi-solid spray, and Rarity grimaced as she realized the poor earth ponies pulling the carriage was probably getting soaked through the badly fitting oatmeal skin coat he wore. She hitched her ride and tried to smile onto her face as she waved and pulled up. "Oh my goodness, sweetheart, you must be freezing," her mother exclaimed, hopping down from the carriage almost before it had stopped moving and sensing up to a large muddy splash. Rarity winced, cringing away as her mother trotted towards her, and the inevitable crushing hug bearing down upon her with muddy hooves. Her father followed a little more reservedly, shielding the tiny filly bundled up in one of those forelegs from the sleet, as Rarity tried her best to avoid any mud from her mother's embrace. "Oh, you poor thing! You were positively soaked. I'm so sorry we're late. I can't believe you had to wait in this for us in the cold. But you know your father, I swear, haven't been less than 20 minutes late since the day we've met." Her father rolled his eyes. Rarity gave him the small, knowing grin behind her mother's back. They all knew the cookie crumbles, but it hadn't come once since the day she had been born. "We better get these things loaded up and get you home," her father said, "and your mother will have a hot meal ready for you in no time." He levitated one of his large trunks, wincing a little as it wobbled towards the carriage, while the carriage pony hefted another. "Oh yes, I've had bread baking all day. I've just have the soup to go with it. I thought I'd try putting it inside the bread, like they do in those fancy Manhattan restaurants. Did you get to eat any of those? Oh, I just can't wait for you to hear all about your trip on the way back." Of course." Rarity's smile wavered just a touch. "I think we better let our little girl rest some first. She'll have plenty of time to tell us everything later," her father said, seemingly to pick up on her reluctance as the last of the luggage was placed onto the carriage's suspension, sagged another itch. "But wait till you hear that Sweetie Belle's been up to while you were gone," he continued, lifting the bundle he still had, where Rarity's little sister's sleeping soundly. Her mother's eyes lit up as she and Rarity moved quickly to the carriage. "Oh, she's just been adorable. I know she's missed you, Rarity. She's been so fussy ever since you left. Oh, and she's being more active by the day. You should see her." That remained the topic of the conversation for during the ride to the parents' home, or to her home. Rarity corrected herself. Cookie relied with her, and every inch of detail of her sister's diminutive adventures during the 5 days Rarity had been away. Listening was a compromise, but one Rarity was still grateful for was as long as her mother was talking about Sweetie Belle, Rarity could put off talking about Manhattan for a little longer. Hopefully until a warm house and warmer food could make it a teeny bit easier to do so. The house was indeed warm, if the soup was almost tolerable, though it did soak through most of the bread before it had the chance to cool. If there was ever a mare who proved baking and cooking while two different arts was a cookie, yet despite Rarity's hopes, one was just enough to lift her mood. Throughout the evening, a frown descended on her face every time she dared to let her mind wander, which happened more and more as the long train ride finally started to take its toll and her eyelids grew painfully heavy. "Thank you so much for dinner, Mother. It was delectably, really," Rarity said, smiling generally at her. "But I think I should go to bed, or I'll have my bags under my eyes for a week." "Oh, you're welcome, sweetheart," her mother replied, hugging her tightly before shooing her towards the stairs. I made sure to clean your room and the bathroom before you got here. Just let us know if you need anything." "Sleep tight, Marshmallow," her father called from the table, his warm grin beaming up at her. "Thank you. Good night," Rarity called back. A warm light of the living room had vanished as she ascended into the unlit upper level. She didn't bother lighting any of the brass lamps to set onto the walls. The clouds had finally thinned a little, and squares of blue-gray moonlight slanted through the windows and guided her down the long, narrow hall towards her bedroom. She just had enough energy to pull up her makeup kit from her saddlebags and remove what little she had bothered to wear that day. As desperately as she wanted to lie down, she knew that she'd regret it in the morning if she left the mascara and eyeshadow on overnight. That done, she stepped heavily into her room and gently kicked the door shut behind her. Everything had been moved. Her mother always tried to put things back in their places when she cleaned, but she usually got most of it mixed up. The sheets smelled like detergent. They were cold and brittle to the touch. As she pulled them back, her father had piled the trunks wherever he could find space. They crowded the floor and even obscured the window of what looked out over still gray water of the pond of their house sat beside. The trunks were filled with nearly every outfit she had ever put together, all packed up in hope that one would prove suitable to be shown in Manhattan. She knew that she would have to unpack it all tomorrow. "I should probably throw out a good deal of it," she thought sadly. "Some of it's old and taking space. It was just foolish to pack it all, but one never knows." She gently heard muffled, high-pitched wails down the stairs. Sweetie Belle was fussing again. Rarity hoped she would not have kept up half the night, or she really would have bags under her eyes all week. Her gaze roved around the dark corners of the room. Moonlight reflected from the glass-framed diploma as she felt the tightness return to her chest. It was dated CE 9994 with the gold leaf seal from the University of Philadelphia stamped neatly above Rarity's signature. She pushed herself to the chilly sheets with less care than usual. She felt her hoof bump against something that nearly slid off the single pony mattress. Glancing up, she saw the back square of her portfolio perched precariously on the edge of the bed. Father must have left it here. The portfolio held photographs of the best designs she'd ever made, as well as detailed drawings of her favorite creative concepts and her almost ambitious ideas. She even had included designs that she had sketched out, but couldn't yet pursue because she lacked some of the equipment or the materials. She looked at it for a moment, then kicked it to the floor beneath the covers. It fell with a muted thud and flipped over once, coming to rest with some of the pages bent beneath it. Rarity turned away and shut her eyes. She was home, had no job, no professional contacts, and had no idea of what to do next. She was back to living with her parents in a little out-of-ways Ponyville, the fashion capital of nothing. She never had felt more than a failure. The next morning, Ning found Rarity sipping a lot of hot chai latte while looking absent-mindedly out the window of the local cafe. The maddening sleet had finally stopped sometime in the night, but the blanket of clouds smothering the sky only seemed to have grown thicker and heavier. The temperature had fallen into a biting chill that penetrated even through the heavy purple and silver sweater she had donned for the day. Fluttershy sat across from her, cradling a steaming cup of musty-smelling green tea blended with bitter goji berries. Rarity looked away from the window. Set her own cup down, and dabbed away at the thin band of the froth of tea had left on her lip. And that was it. I didn't get anything more than a vague promises from a few secretaries, and I wasn't able to get any more interviews before I had to come home. Oh, Rarity, I'm so sorry, Fluttershy said, her mouth drawn into a pitying grimace. I can't believe so many of them would just cancel your interviews like that. Cancel is an understatement, Rarity said, staring into her cup. Stiff-collar staff pretended to have no record of an appointment at all. They said he was engaged in all-day meetings and couldn't possibly arrange anything. And then, out of all the things, Stiff-collar himself happened to pass me in the lobby on my way out, and I overheard him talking about taking a client out for golf and lunch. Oh my goodness, but that doesn't seem right, Fluttershy said quietly. Business is business, Rarity said, trying to affect in a brisk tone. Flawless stitch and tread was wonderful though, and I still can't quite believe seemed stressed herself and gave me an interview. But it was the same answer each time. Your work shows wonderful potential, but we're really looking for somebody with more experience. Rarity snorted lightly and shook her head, a polite way of saying they weren't impressed even if I heard one. So what will you do? Fluttershy asked. I don't know, Fluttershy. Rarity sighed and looked back out the window. I mean, I suppose I'm not terribly surprised. Going to the big firms was a desperate gamble to begin with. It's just so much harder to find design firms in other cities. Manhattan is really the fashion capital of Equestria, unless you count the Canter lot, of course. But Celestia knows I won't get anywhere near there for years. I'm sure something will come up. Maybe something will open up here. I know your parents weren't looking forward to seeing you going so far away. Rarity glanced back at Fluttershy, a fond smile playing across her face at the unstated implication. She hadn't looking forward to leaving Fluttershy behind either. Rarity knew many ponies in town, but Fluttershy was just the one she had ever found a close rapport with. There was no one else that she could talk shop with while her parents indulged her. It was hardly satisfying the conversation, and it usually ended with something like, "Oh, that's nice, sweetheart. Pass the flour, wouldn't you?" Fluttershy listened. However, she didn't let some pony talk. She took every word as carefully as she could in the birds she cared for in her cottage every winter, just like she was listening to Rarity now. I know, darling, Rarity said, hiding her smile just behind another sip of her cha. But, unless you know any of these design firms that happened to set up shop here in a week while I was gone, I really don't know what much more I can do here. I understand, Fluttershy's eyes betrayed at the hint of sadness as she smiled back. This isn't really a town for ponies, well, careers, at least ones like yours. I'm afraid that's a bit of an understatement. The closest thing we have to Fashion Outlet is the old Bridal Bits tack shop, and I'm fairly certain that he doesn't want my expertise. No, Fluttershy giggled. I doubt he does. She took another sip of her tea. Still, I wish I could help more. I don't think I know well enough to tell you what to do. I don't think I do either, Fluttershy, Rarity sighed. I don't think I do either. Rarity wandered aimlessly after she left the calf. She asked Fluttershy if she would like to take a longer walk, but Fluttershy had apologized and said she needed to get back home. Shivering, Rarity wondered if Fluttershy had just thought it was too cold to stay out. If so, she could hardly blame her. Under normal circumstances, Rarity would hardly linger outside longer than absolutely necessary. But the only other place she had to go was home. The home to the sketches and mock-ups that she had gotten a little more than extremely expensive sightseeing trip and some stressful conversations. Her mother would be there, popping in every 10 minutes asking if she needed anything or trying to strike up the conversation with the latest gossip from the older generations in town. Little Sweetie Belle would probably be making noise too, and any chance Rarity might have of figuring out where she had been gone or where to go next, she'd be thrown out the window. So she wandered, her sweater and hat soaking up all the cold, like a sponge in a icy lake. Two thin scarfs fitting in to and fro, like Auntie's spirit in the breeze. The day's drier weather had brought shoppers creeping up from their homes into the market. She noticed them as gray shadows as they passed the front and around her. She wished for her comment to Fluttershy about Ponyville's fashion had just been jest, but she looked at the muted bustle around her. She realized just how bad the issue had always been. There is really no market for fashion in this town, she thought. Even now, when the bitter weather demanded all of her hardiest ponies don some kind of protection. All she saw was ghastly utilitarian coats and hats from the tack shop, chunky, formless things made from heavy black and brown cloth to dingy puffs or fleece peeking out beneath. Here and there she saw the pale imitations of decent fashion purchases from the shelves of barnyard bargains. They were cheap, badly made things, and she guessed they didn't do a good job of holding the cold at bay, judging by the way ponies were wearing them and shivered and grimaced with every breeze. And a little wonder, Rarity thought. The fittings are loose approximations at best. You'd think Filthy Rich believed we all had the exact same body type or something? She thought back to the owner of the cab her parents had hired yesterday, and wondered if his ill-fitting oilskin was still another victim of the production lines Filthy Rich employed to mass-produce the stuff. I should have offered to the tailor from the fit uniform. No pony deserves to be out pulling carriages in gear like that. She followed one of her favorite walking routines, which took her out of the marketplace and into the village park. The grass had gone down to brush after running some of the leaves. A black spiny tree limb stabbed nakedly into the sky like the legs of the monstrous spiders in their death throes. A fountain had frozen over, leaving dirty water solidified into a shapeless mass at the bottom of the chipped stone bowl. She carried on past it, climbing a low hill midway, and the forest that offered a view of the town that was normally much more pleasant. The town cemetery was built here, but she usually passed through it before cutting through the whitetail woods to circle town and drive back home. She then passed the thin rods of pitted ruffle iron fencing that enclosed the graveyard. She was supposed to notice that she was not alone. A pink earth pony stood in the corner of the cemetery, her head bowed over the small gravestone. Rarity turned away respectfully and then looked over the town. Ponyville was just laid out below her from a puddle, the large windmill spinning listlessly as ponies drifted in and out of sight among the buildings. There's just no color, she said to herself quietly. There's just no use for any kind of talent in this place. I don't belong here anymore. The only response was the hiss of the wind that burned through the thoughts of the nearby trees. Somewhere nearby, dead leaves rustled away as they were blown away. Still, she continued, it's hard to believe that it's just because there is no demand. There had to be at least a few ponies who would buy a bit more discriminately given the chance. She would think of a few, without even trying. Fluttershy, the Riches, the owners of the finer shops, the mayor and her staff, and she even knew for a fact that many of those same ponies ordered garments from suppliers in Manhattan and Canterlot because they needed finer culture than any pony in town could provide. Something really should be done, she mused with a thoughtful frown. She considered it, and her heart clenched with the apprehension that she was beginning to know well, but at the same time, there was a familiar little hook in her head. A mental tug that she felt inspiration struck instantly pulled her towards the realization of a new idea. Ponyville had no fashion market that either made its town that was hopelessly devoid of demand, or a town with ravenous, feminine-induced demand that was just waiting for the right merchant to come down and see it with a creative vision. Her mind wandered back to the university economics courses, the ones that she had barely managed to slog through the passing marks. She remembered the case studies that she had chosen for her papers, stories of how now famous boutiques had now started with nothing more than sweat and a sewing machine at just the right times to fill the markets with clothes before they even had desperately wanted. She could think of 1,000 reasons that it was a bad idea, and profoundly a stupid one. Whatever the case studies said, those ponies had definitely possessed more resources than she would right now, such as startup funds, a cheap, reliable source of materials, perhaps wealthy family with spare storefronts, and warehouses to gift to them. They also wanted to seem like an inborn knowledge of exactly what to do with those resources. In a business-savvy way of Manhattan skyscrapers, employee population packed into one brilliant multi-talent mind. But even so, her mind wouldn't stop flooding with the possibilities, as if reliving her walk through the market. She saw the once vague forms of ponies, there in perfect detail. A stallion strolling by in a parka, with overlarge, his limbs were awkwardly splayed, and he had to manage a funny little waddle to get by. In a flash, she had mentally replaced it with the trim crisp of pea coat, giving him a flair of casual formality to accentuate his refined jawline and mane cut. She remembered the mare by the baker's shop wearing pitifully thin, bright orange autumn and windbreaker that clashed violently with her pink hair. Her two foals clad outfits that suited them just as poorly. She sized them with her memory, her eyes lifting about as she gazed at nothing in the cemetery. The filly blue like her mother, but a little paler. She was hanging back at the window, so probably a little demure, shy even. But what a heart she must have had behind those riveting green eyes, something gray accented into red to bring those out a little swinging coat, maybe with matching hind boots. The colt, the one rearing up and leaning on the window. Oh, he's the rambunctious one, is he? Something close-fitting with a strong, significant outer shell. Nothing less would do. And the mother, wouldn't something like that princess cut frock I would have put away in one of my trunks to look fabulous? Though maybe in a different color. Rarity saw all this and little traits of all the ponies she had jumped out of her, had practically cried out to be accentuated by the textiles, and while measurements and details snapped into place on patterned sheets, flying through her mind. It was an absurd idea she tried to dismiss as something as she couldn't possibly think of attempting without a great deal of more experience or education on her resume. Nevertheless, she could possibly have left her mind. Well, I suppose there's no harm in looking into a little more. Perhaps I can drop by the library soon and see if there's any articles on this sort of thing. That decided, she turned and started towards the back of the cemetery gate. She left the graveyard behind as she noticed no other pony had left at some point. Seeing no sign of wayfarers on the familiar path through the thickly clustered trees of Whitetail Woods, Rarity passed into the shadows of the trees, and the cemetery was soon hidden from sight. Occupied with her thoughts, she hardly noticed the heaps of mud-brown leaves that sent waves of souping, wet, spongy smell to their nostrils with every step. The innumerable trees had finally strangled the incense breeze, leaving all of their hair still and clear. Rarity's mind, however, was becoming increasingly cluttered with ideas. One by one, the impossibilities had turned into questions she might just be able to find answers to. Hey, if the Fred Tread could do it, then why not? The rasp of damp leaves sliding over each other had disrupted her train of thought, and she shook her head a little in annoyance, refocusing her questions. Hayseed all the things I need to do. I need a shop for starters. There's no way I could do anything sharing a space with 2 parents and a growing filly. Another heap of leaves was disturbed by the wind nearby, and Rarity huffed in annoyance. There was something especially distracting about the sound today. Something in her mind wanted to puzzle out, but there was more important matters at hoof, or at least more interesting ones. Still, she glanced about, expecting to find a piece of renewed focus and the motionless branches. She only found herself unsettled. Aside from her own shuffling hoofsteps, it was totally silent. The animals had held either migrated or prepared for their burrows in preparation for the oncoming snow. There wasn't a breath of the wind to be felt or a hint of motion to be seen. There was nothing to stir the wet leaves that suddenly rustled somewhere behind her. Rarity turned and glanced back, brow furrowed in confusion. The path leading away from her was empty and barren. Nothing moved there that she could see. Their circumstances, however, were giving a rise in paranoia that she felt unwillingly to casually dismiss, despite the obvious answer that there were probably still a few animals active during the winter. Her imagination was putting shadowy figures where they didn't belong, sensing someone watching her who wasn't there. She resumed her pace, glancing around every few steps. The thin path vanished into obscurity ahead of her, and the forest's dense growth and detritus has cluttered the ground around it. Thin trees clogged the space with jagged barren boughs that stuck out across the empty spaces like twinkled knives. But at the very least, one thing seemed clear. The forest around her was empty. Leaves rasped softly, accompanied by a thin, feeble creak. Rarity's ear twitched at the sound, and her eyes followed a distant ladder. A single low-hanging branch, about 10 feet away from the edge path, was quivering gently as if a bird had just taken flight. She had turned homeward again and continued to trot. This isn't Manhattan, she told herself. This is Ponyville for Celestia's sake. Nothing happened in Ponyville. A lady could take 1,000 walks in its darkest and most desolated areas for decades and never come to harm. She was safe. She ignored the leaves that she could hear behind her. It was the animals, birds, a stray breeze that was merciful enough to leave her frigid, shivering body alone. Nothing more. But when the twig snapped, she couldn't help herself. She swung her whole body around, eyes piercing the dim light for the source. For a moment she saw nothing but the familiar path through the woods. Then about 30 feet away and a few yards away from the side path of the path, she saw the tree's outline that bulged a little ways off the ground in just such a way that looked like a head perched on top of the long neck. It looked like it was leaning ever so slightly away from the trunk, and the shadows fell in nearly right spots to give the impression of the distant eyes looking at her beneath an ear-like twig. "Who's there?" Rarity called, impressed that her voice sounded as stern as it did. The pony shape didn't move. Rarity took a step towards it, then another step, and 2 more. It didn't move, but the sense she got it from those eyes. No, the eyes. I'm imagining, she told herself. Intensified, she felt like a fool who had wandered into the very high end of the shop and suddenly met a unfriendly shopkeeper who knew she didn't belong here, who wanted her to get out. Rarity backed away, glancing around before bringing the strange shadowy shape into her view. It continued to remain perfectly still as she neared the next exit bend path where it would be difficult for her to see it any longer. She had almost convinced herself that she had been spooked by nothing more than an oddly shaped chunk of bark. But you aren't sure, her mind seemed to say. Don't be scared. There is no reason to venture off of this path. It's muddy enough as it is. Despite herself, she continued walking as quietly as she could, but she heard nothing that would indicate anything following behind her. After a few minutes of careful listening, she picked up her pace to brisk to a trot and keep an eye out for the cottages at the edge of Ponyville. She was looking forward to getting out of the woods into the warmth of her parents' home. as she left the tree line and stepped into the hard-packed roads of Ponyville. She couldn't help but continue to keep her eyes and ears trained for any sign of something amiss. But she noticed something. Her house was just down the lane. As she quickened her pace in anticipation to a warm fire and maybe a mug of hot chocolate to relax, as she mulled over the ideas that had come to her. But as she laid her hoof on the freezing iron of the door latch, her ears twitched at the strange feeling. Anxiety returned, and the feeling of being noticed and carefully watched. As she looked around her and saw a few ponies going about their business, none of them were looking at her. She glanced around at the edge of town, where in the beginnings of the forest path was just visible. She couldn't see anything clearly at this distance, but she thought that she could just make out the faint shape of a pony standing just behind the first trees, looking straight at her as she stood by her parents' door. Rarity shrank back in for a moment, then hurriedly let herself in, before firmly shutting off the cold air and that anything remained out of it. What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, stay pretty.